God of War Ragnarok drowns you in options, things to do and awesome items to get, and while it's easy to get lost in this massive game, you will want to be smart about some of the decisions that you'll take along the way, which is why in today's video we're gonna talk about some of the biggest mistakes I was also guilty of, so you don't have to repeat them. But one of the first things I recommend you do right away is to swap the action and the dodge buttons in the settings menu. This is something that we also did back in 2018, and if you're used to the way how most games out there have the dodge button dedicated to the circle, then this will make the most amount of sense, and at the same time will make action now to become X. I never understood why Sony Santa Monica chose the default layout with the circle, but this is way more intuitive. Also, since the action button is the one you get to now use in the new traversal mechanic, having that on X instead makes it feel like you're jumping with the proper button like in most games out there. And by the way, I also suggest setting the sprint to auto so Kratos now actually runs when moving the thumbstick as opposed to having to press it down every single time. At number 2, don't just rush the main objective yet, also do some of the side content, especially since you would otherwise be losing on so much gear, upgrades and cool side stories that you won't be able to come back to until many hours later at the end of the next chapter. So instead of always following the orange marker, also pay attention to the blue and even gray ones on your map. Without spoiling anything, here's a few in the starting 15 hours that you should keep in mind. Early on in Svartalfheim, once you get out of the dwarven town of Nidavellir, take the path on the right side instead of the left side and head over to the massive sources of smoke that you see in the background. These are an excellent source of loot, enemies, a hidden new favor that involves upgrading your weapons and even crafting some really awesome starting armor, so it is definitely worth it. If you otherwise follow the main objective here, you would not be able to come back until you pretty much finished the entire story up until that point in this specific realm, which could take at least a couple of hours. Another one is in Alfheim, though this one is a bit different. At the end of the chapter, you'll be given the selection between going back through a portal or remaining in this realm. As always, I suggest lingering for longer, as there's at least a couple of side quests here with a ton more loot and some of the best early gear that you will want to get. Now, moving on to number 3, let's talk a bit about elemental damage. In God of War Ragnarok, this is now even more important than in the previous game. With the new signature triangle attacks, it's easier to also apply them against enemies, and there's builds in there that definitely encourage you to switch between different elementals to buff your next elemental. So in this case, Leviathan has the Frost Awaken, which imbues your next attack with a guaranteed frost damage. Meanwhile, the Blades have the Whiplash, where repeatedly tapping triangle will imbue your attacks with fire damage. Many early and especially late game foes will have these fire or frost protections on their health bars that you have to pretty much use the opposite effect in order to take them down and deal damage to their real HP bars. So pay close attention to them, and eventually you might even want to unlock these powerful light and heavy follow-ups in the technique line of each weapon to immediately unleash the elemental damage on multiple targets around you. At number 4, upgrading weapons is done very similarly to 2018, as in we still need the Frozen and the Chaos Flames to level up our blades and the axe, except this time around there's also a new twist, which comes in the form of these fragments we get from some hidden encounters. So these hidden encounters are called Draugr Holes. They are part of a favor called Born from Fire, and basically every realm has at least a few of these where you have to fight some tougher Draugr mini-boss as well as his minions. Once defeated, you'll get some drops in the center of the fire pit, which is going to include at least one of these new Chaos Spark items. If we combine 6 of these sparks, they will give us one Chaos Flame that we can then use to upgrade our weapon, though I believe there are some variants for the axe in there too. The rest will pretty much come from main story bosses and a couple of challenge bosses as well, just like how it was in the first game, so that we can level these weapons all the way up to level 9. And it's totally worth doing it every single time you have one. The damage alone is more than worth it, plus you don't really get to use them at anything else. Moving on to number 5, loot is extremely abundant in Ragnarok, but that doesn't mean you should skip on any of the chests, even if you're in the literal middle of a chase or anything of sorts. So these will still be in the same way they were back in 2018, with the wooden chest still providing hex silver. The stone chest with the red glow will provide crafting materials usually. Legendary ornate chests with a golden outglow will give you pieces of gear or sometimes even runic attacks. And finally, the Nornir chests, which are the ones that involve some kind of very short puzzle, usually give you either a health or a range upgrade. But there's many more collectibles that either give you loot or even more stats. While in Svartalfheim, for example, pay attention to the blue Yggdrasil Jew that hangs by some of these tree branches, as they will increase your cooldown stat by 2 every time you get one. Then there's also the new loot twinks, which are these smaller Ormir creatures that can drop extra loot and resources, but the kicker is that, yeah, if you attack them frontally, they will immediately hide. So what you have to do instead is to either flank them or find a way to attack them from behind, which in this case will drop quite a lot of loot, sometimes even more than many of the chests in the game. Of course, if you somehow left any of these resources on the ground and forgot to collect them, then don't worry, once you get back to Sindri, you can pretty much collect them back from his blue chest of lost loot. And finally, also sell any artifacts that are still collecting dust in your inventory. You'll get plenty of these throughout your journeys, and they don't really have any use past the lore entry, so you can just sell them for like hundreds and even thousands of hex silver right away. And speaking of using and getting resources, and number 6, another big tip is to not waste crafting resources, especially early on upgrading every single piece of gear that you get. Just identify and focus a build instead and make that one work. With the abundance of things to unlock as you progress more, it's not really smart to waste resources upgrading some pieces of gear that you're going to end up replacing in just a few more minutes. So instead, maybe hold off for a few more missions, progress a bit in the main story or even the side missions, and see what follows next in your inventory. Oftentimes you will find that there's a new armor set that you can craft that can be really powerful. The best way to look at it is to judge what skills you like using the most, how you can buff them, what types of encounters you find the hardest, and how you can solve them. For example, if you often find yourself overwhelmed by many enemies and quickly drop your HP, maybe having a better defense armor like the early Nidavellir set could help a lot with that, but it might not be as efficient against bosses, so if instead you have problems with them, then it wouldn't hurt to invest more in increasing your damage if you can already nail down the parry windows. Now, speaking of parrying, this is another big mistake you'll want to focus on resolving early on, and that is not nailing down the parry windows. If you're constantly relying on dodges, just know that some attacks are telegraphed in such a way that they will still land on you more often than not. The game already points out attacks that you can parry with the yellow ring, but you can also parry the ones completely unmarked just by paying attention to the enemy when it's about to reach you. Also, many enemies do chain attacks that can punish your first parry if you're not on your toes, so instead keep in mind that and parry again the following attack too, which only then interrupts that enemy. And speaking of interrupts, I really like the idea of the new blue markers, because these indicate the enemy is about to wind up a powerful skill that instead you can completely interrupt with a simple double tap of the L1. In fact, many later game bosses will have more devastating AoE abilities that you will want to interrupt as soon as you see them being casted, otherwise risk losing huge chunks of your HP. And finally, for the red ones, as always, you just have to dodge them the usual way, or maybe sometimes use runic animations as they can interrupt them or at least mitigate the damage while you are under its animation. This all boils down to using everything the game throws at you to your advantage, including the environments themselves. Every single realm will have at least one of these new mechanics to deal with annoying enemies. In Svartalfheim, for example, this includes the collapsible pillars that you can shoot with Atreus' sonic arrows to cause the enemies to fall down. Alfheim also features these reflective rocks that you can use to solve puzzles, but you can also reflect your axe throws into enemies, which means breaking their defenses completely many times. And there's plenty of rocks, trees, and other things to grab and hurl at entire groups that you can then follow up with stun grabs. And speaking of stun grabs, just like in the first game, the bare fists are some of the best if you want to increase the enemy stun meter. You can probably also pin one with the axe and then switch to the knuckles or a different weapon and just take care of multiple enemies at the same time. And if you ever happen to be overwhelmed by groups of enemies, don't just stay there and face tank everything. Go ahead, grab onto a ledge or a jump point, disengage, and maybe flank some of the other lone targets in the encounter. Now moving on to number 9, let's talk about a few of the stats on the gear that you might find confusing. While the general stuff like strength, defense, and vitality are pretty self-explanatory, there's a few more like runic, luck, and cooldown that you might not really know the full effect of. So here it goes. Runic, think of these as the runic attacks. This stat basically influences these types of damage sources of the runes and also increases elemental damage. Luck is the stat that affects the rate at which you get hex silver and XP from encounters and such, so this could be a great stat to focus early on during the leveling process to do it a lot faster. Cooldown, think of this as more like an end game kind of stat that you will focus on later on. It's basically, while the higher it is, the more it reduces the cooldown of skills and abilities, but you will need quite a lot of it before you start seeing any noticeable differences, which is why you will need a proper build for that. In the meantime, just focus on the Hanging Dew in Svartalfheim. And last but not least, at number 10, you might notice a lot of puzzles that at first don't seem to have any solution, and especially so you might lack a certain upgrade. Well, in this case, the reason for that is because you still need to progress a little bit in this main story and maybe get a new type of tool or maybe get a companion with you to help you with it in one way or another. So in this case, whenever you made some major progress somewhere, got a cool new flashy tool or maybe some character to help you and augment your powers, go back to these locations, keep them in mind, and who knows, you might encounter some really cool stuff, maybe some piece of loot that you can't get otherwise or some secret encounter. Totally let me know down below how many of these you got to implement in your own playthrough. If you also enjoyed the video, a thumbs up and even subscribing to the channel would help me a ton, and I will see you guys in the next video.